Hello and welcome to The Print. A recent working paper titled Rise in Tobacco Consumption and Policy Implications by PM Economic Advisory Council member Dr. Shamika Ravi and young professional Partha Protim Burman highlights a worrying trend. Tobacco consumption in India is rising sharply. In urban households, there has been an increase of around 59% in tobacco consumption, whereas in rural households, it is around 33%. To discuss more on this, I am today joined by Dr. Shamika Ravi, co-author of the report and also a member of PM Economic Advisory Council. Hello ma'am and welcome to The Print.
Thank you.
So ma'am, I want to start by asking you that your study highlights a sharp rise in tobacco usage.
Right.
So what is one of the most single striking finding that you find in your research and analysis?
To tell you the truth, I was surprised at the incidence in general that more and more households across spectrum, urban and rural, across the quintile groups, meaning rich and poor, seem to be now consuming tobacco products, right? And the reason it is surprising is that one, of course, is the magnitude of the increase, but this is happening at a time when we have had policies and stringent policies as far as taxation is concerned, as far as other regulatory norms, not selling near schools and so on and so forth. So, I think the overall finding itself to me was surprising. Another reason I think it did astonish me is because it goes against the global trends. Globally, tobacco consumption is actually falling. But in India, it seems to be rising and rising rather rapidly.
And also in the urban households, means we expect that there will be more awareness. But even the increase there is much more sharper than the rural areas. So like, what do you believe that, why is that happening?
Well, first of all, it's a myth that urban households are more aware. In today's day and age of cell phones and electronic medium, I think everyone has access to knowledge and information, and the government has had campaigns in terms of what can be showcased. You've noticed in the movies they constantly keep flashing smoking is injurious and so on. So I don't think it's lack of knowledge with it.
Ma'am, in last 10 years, one of the most striking thing for me was in last 10 years, gutka consumption in rural areas grew by 565%.
Yeah.
That is a very sharp increase.
That's correct.
Like, what are the factors behind like gutka spending so much in rural areas?
So one thing is the spending itself rising, which is that in terms of rupee value, people are spending more. As a share of the monthly per capita consumption expenditure, meaning the total spending at an individual level, that share is also rising. But the biggest growth is happening in the form of newer households consuming. So the consumption itself, the market is expanding, right? And that is the worrying trend. There are multiple reasons for it. And it has to do with the supply side. It's not just typically when we think of it's a cultural aspect of life and hence people consume. I think from the supply side, the markets have been extremely creative. If you think of the way gutka, Kenny, BD, etc. By the way, all of this fall then under the regulated, or a very large part of it is not falling within the tobacco tax rise policy, for instance, that we talk about, because that pertains to the cigarette market, which is formal and regulated. But there is a very large unregulated and informal segment of the market. So people are consuming those as well, right? And if you see, if you just look at the advertisements, you look at the hoardings, all big events, these are the companies that seem to be marketing through these and the bigger sponsors. If you look at the sale of product, then they do not require a minimum spending, right? What usually happens is if you have to buy a packet of cigarette, it's of a certain amount and above, but you are selling individual cigarettes, that's number one. Yeah. Small sachets. This is like the marketing marvels we used to read 30 years back. from ITC and HLL, etc., which said that, shampoos are selling more because we have smaller sachets. So these are marketing case studies. A lot of them seem to have been employed in this industry as well.
And even in the rural area, there has been a shift in last 10 years from a more towards a branded products. Like people have moved from BDs to gutka consumption, which is a more a branded product. So how do you explain this reason? Is it like an increase in the income that you
It is affordability. More people can afford this product. It is definitely getting normalized. I think as a researcher, somebody who's concerned about the general welfare, this is a problem. That affordability has increased, but so has the normalization around consumption of these products. It is now becoming increasingly acceptable in all social circles, most age groups, genders, etc., to consume this. And I think that is a big problem.
And even in the per monthly capita expenditure, so the cigarette, the tobacco consumption has saw like a 58% increase in rural areas and around 77% increase. So how much impact do this tobacco consumption is having in the household financing?
Well, you see, because people now have more money, on the whole, you're seeing that consumption expenditure, even controlled for inflation, and remember, different states have different inflation, right? Because they have different logistic costs, etc. So products don't rise the same way everywhere. The accounting for the differences in inflation across the places, you are still seeing a rising share and rising number of households that are consuming this product, right? The concern, of course, is from a welfare perspective that in states like Meghalaya, which really does stand out, a monthly per capita consumption expenditure of 9 to 10% is being spent on tobacco products, right? Which is a multiple. It's 3 times as much as what is being spent on education, 2.5 times what is being spent on healthcare. So clearly the welfare of the household is impacted, right? Because there is a crowding out. You are seeing that people are spending more on these products in some parts than on what we consider as essential services like education and health.
And ma'am, your paper also talks about a moral hazard.
Yeah.
The fact is that because the government is spending more on healthcare expenses, that gives less incentives for people to change their habits or avoid unhealthy habits. So how strong evidence did you find in your research regarding this?
So, moral hazard in healthcare is a long-standing problem. There is a reason we say that in a market like the US, the largest economy of the world, which spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare, is because the financing is public, is private, right? So if you have insurance financed healthcare, the incentive to cut down on consumption, which is what moral hazard deals with. Moral hazard is basically telling you that you are not bearing the true cost of your bad habits, right? So you tend to overutilize because the real cost is subsidized. So the obvious impact of consuming tobacco and this kind of rise is being reflected in the rise in the non-communicable diseases, many kinds of cardiovascular ailments, etc. Now, the cost associated with these ailments is also rising, which means we have to devote a larger share of Ayushman Bharat. If you look at only the publicly financed part of it, that is a big fiscal problem, because you are going to see the health risks and the fiscal risks. It's like a double whammy, right? It's a twin problem.
One of the other findings is that the differences in the state level data, like the northeastern states, as you mentioned, Meghalaya, Mizoram, have shown high level of tobacco consumption, almost more than 90% of the households.
Yes.
And in comparison to southern states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, it's very low. It's like contrasting differences. How do you explain this difference in the pattern? Is it a more cultural thing?
I think so. What else would explain these kind of big differences? However, I think cross-state differences, Udit, are important, but even for any given state, the time trends are also equally important, right? So, if you look at one of our southern states, like let's look at Karnataka.
Yeah.
So, you are seeing a growth, right? You are seeing a significant growth even in places where traditionally you had very little consumption. So, I think the rising trend is a all India phenomenon.
And even in the northeastern states, it's across both, like the both urban households and rural households.
That's
It is
correct.
not like just
That's true.
rural households that
That's
is
true.
showing.
That's true.
But one of
But there is a point to be made there. The relative growth in rural, and that too in the bottom 50%, is much higher.
yeah,
Which then means, the equity concerns of all kinds that we have is only going to get exaggerated more. Remember also, Ayushman Bharat focuses on the bottom 50% of the population.
and that's also so. Like your paper also highlights that the less than 40% of the consumption households, the tobacco consumption is more on that segment of the society.
That's true.
So is that because say the poverty or something like that that forces them to consume like these products?
Well, we have less poverty now there.
Yeah.
We used to have 30% poverty 10, 12 years back. Today
Yeah.
it is down to 3.9%.
Yeah.
So, poverty is not the answer. I do think there is a push factor. I do think it's the advertisements, it's the fact that it's marketed it's sold in very small sachet, which means everyone can afford it, right? It's really small sachets and it's sold everywhere. So, we will have to think harder in terms of putting restrictions on advertisements, and particularly that target vulnerable segments like young people, like children, school kids.
So, and that was my next question. Like, despite the high rising taxes the government has implemented,
Yeah.
the regulations, this pattern is against those because that
Yeah.
is what the government wants to,
Yeah.
to curtail down these consumption habits.
Yeah.
So, does this indicate that the tobacco consuming policies are failing maybe and not getting the desired outcome that we want?
They are not failing, but they are clearly inadequate.
Yeah.
Right? Because we are still targeting a segment of the tobacco market, which is the formal and the one which is taxed. Literature across countries, but even within India, tells you that when something becomes expensive, people tend to shift to other products, right? So, there is a high degree of substitutability. But that is not necessarily what is happening here, because newer households are now reporting that they are consuming tobacco products. The spending is actually rising as a share of consumption expenditure, it is rising. So, it's I think it's just a massive increase in consumption, and I think we will have to use policy instruments to get a better situation.
If you have to put a factors that is contributing to the rise in tobacco consumption, so one is obviously the producers of these products, they are coming with the marketing and all those techniques. And do you think that the popular culture like movies and TV shows, those also offer some kind of a shift or maybe a incentive to consume those?
Absolutely, it's a normalization,
Yeah.
right? It's cool now. It's not just normalized, it's cool to consume these products, and that seems to be acceptable to the wider audience. And I think that is what the policy instrument has to be against, that we cannot normalize this kind of consumption behavior, particularly again when it comes to minors, youth.
Ma'am, around 13 lakh people annually die due to tobacco consumption.
That's correct.
And that's like almost 1.3 million. So, what are the long-term public health and fiscal implications if this trend continues?
Well, first, any kind of public insurance for health, and right now we have Ayushman Bharat, that is going to get more and more expensive, right? Because NCDs, the kind of non-communicable diseases that we are seeing and that are directly impacted by consumption of tobacco, you're going to see the cost of those rising, right? That is first impact. The second is, of course, increasing taxation will mean greater revenue for the state, but that's a segment of the market where, because close substitutes are available, people are switching to different products, and there is a lot of consumption below the radar which the government is not able to tax. So there are fiscal concerns. Moral hazard definitely is a big problem, because the less expensive or the less costly the state makes health care by early screening, and which we are now beginning to expand and so on, early screening for NCDs and all, means there is a public sort of cost being borne for habits which are definitely private, right? It is behaviors of individuals which is going to drive overall implications for the state as well as central taxes and fiscal situation. So I do think that we will have to make the policies far more comprehensive. We will have to bring in other segments of the market also within. There has to be some degree of equalization or rationalization of taxes across products. So they're all equally costly. Right? Costly not from the cost of making, informal might still be cheaper, but at least as far as the taxes are concerned, you're affecting the affordability of all these substitutes in similar way. So people are not driven into one market or the other. But also I think marketing, we will have to think very seriously about cracking down on marketing and this level of marketing which is targeting young people.
So ma'am, if according to you, if policymakers have to prioritize one particular intervention, whether it will be taxation, regulation, more awareness campaigns, or restrictions completely,
right?
So what would be the most effective way, do you think, that we can bring it down?
Not complete restriction to that. As an economist, I am averse to that, because people consume, people do all kinds of things, right? It's not the state's job to put a restriction, because the minute you ban something, it tends to go below the radar. It becomes informal, hence more risky. You're not going to be able to verify, test quality. It's likely to become more spurious and other issues. But you definitely make it costlier. Taxation is one of those, right? You make it less glamorous. I think that is where the marketing and the kind of campaigns which are currently being run, we will have to be creative and sort of counter the general movement which is making these products cool amongst school children.
So ma'am, now coming to off topic, so I just wanted to touch upon the tweet, the West Bengal tweet that you recently did, that's stating that the top 20% of the urban households saw a decline in real consumption in last 10 years of a CAGR of minus 0.4%. So can you elaborate on that? Like, why do you think that that is happening?
Why do I think that is not what the research has looked at, but we can all guess. Clearly it is linked with governance, the growth of the state, the kind of growth the state is seeing, the kind of lack of industrialization, or if you look at investment flow into the state. Then there are multiple reasons which are a cause of concern. But I think, Udit, it's important to first of all understand that household consumption expenditure, which is what the NSSO does, right, from Ministry of Statistics, it is available for all states. We have this data available, the last one from 2011-12. So I really think we deserve to have much more economic intelligence into our public discourse. Let us try and find out that which segments, which states, which quintile groups, rich, poor, etc., who is gaining, how much, and if there are people losing out, who are the people losing out? And clearly this is a result for the top quintile of urban West Bengal. It's a shocking result, right? That the real consumption level today is lesser than what it was 12 years back. But I mean, that goes contrary to what the national trend is. Almost every state and every segment of the economy is seeing a very rapid increase in consumption. People have better quality of life. People are eating more, they are buying more clothes, they are traveling more. That's what consumption is about. And here is a segment that is actually in real terms worse off.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us and speaking to The Print. As India expands healthcare access, the challenge will be to balance the treatment with strong prevention and behavioral change. Thank you for tuning in.